The Goodyear blimp is one of the world's most recognized advertising tools. The blimps have become so associated with American college football that in 2019 the Goodyear blimp was made an honorary inductee into college football's Hall of Fame, the first inductee who was neither a player nor a coach. The Goodyear blimps today carry on a nearly century-long tradition, even though today's Goodyear blimps aren't technically blimps at all, but semi-rigid zeppelins. But in the long history of Goodyear blimps, one lesson that we've learned is that blimps are difficult to fly. A lesson that was spectacularly demonstrated 92 years ago when the Goodyear blimp Columbia crashed in front of thousands of onlookers into one of the most populous parts of New York City. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was incorporated in Akron, Ohio, August 29, 1898, by brothers Frank and Charles Sieberling, and named in honor of inventor Charles Goodyear, who had invented the process of vulcanization of rubber in the 1840s. The website of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area Partnership explains that in the beginning, 13 employees were hired for manufacturing bicycle tires. Goodyear started as a manufacturer of bicycle tires, horseless carriage tires, horseshoe pads, and later moved into automobile tires, along with many other rubberized parts. While Goodyear would become a leader in the manufacturing of automobile tires, that was not their only pursuit. In 1910, Goodyear established an aeronautics department with the goal, the Goodyear heritage site Wingfoot Stories explains, of marketing their rubber-impregnated fabrics and coatings for airplanes and lighter-than-air craft. By 1912, Goodyear was producing balloons in Akron, used in prestigious competitions. But the company's goal was more ambitious. Wingfoot Stories continues. In 1916, Goodyear bought 720 acres of land southeast of Akron to serve as a flying field and manufacturing site. It included Fritch's Lake, which provided water power for a grist mill and a water reserve for factories several miles downstream. The Wingfoot Lake facility is still in use today, the center of operations for Goodyear. It is the oldest airship hangar in the United States. A historical marker placed there in 2018 reads, in March 1917, a month before U.S. entry into World War I, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company began construction of the hangar on land the firm purchased here in 1916. Wingfoot Stories writes, the initial structure was 100 feet wide, 90 feet high, and 200 feet long. Its length was doubled to 400 feet, almost immediately. The same month that construction started, Goodyear became part of a multi-company contract to build 16, and eventually 20, non-rigid airships for the United States Navy. These blimps followed a design by U.S. naval engineer Jerome Hunsaker and were called the B-class. Goodyear produced 9 of the envelopes for the B-class, with gondolas, a modified JN-4 aircraft fuselage built by the Curtiss Corporation. As the facility at Wingfoot Lake had not yet been completed, the blimp was assembled and launched from the expansive grounds of the White City Amusement Park in Chicago. Goodyear also manufactured envelopes for the larger C-class blimps in 1918. The blimps of the B and C class were generally successful, although several were involved in accidents and lost. They used hydrogen as lifting gas, as was common at the time, but of course the problem with hydrogen is that it is highly flammable, a problem that would cause disaster, in 1919. While Goodyear built the envelopes to hold the gas, the B and C class blimps were assembled and operated by the Navy. In 1919, Goodyear built its own blimp and named it Wingfoot Air Express. The 168-foot airship, carrying 100,000 cubic feet of hydrogen gas, had been built for testing and exhibition. The International News Service wrote that it was to be the first passenger-carrying dirigible built for commercial purposes in the United States. On July 21st, 1919, the Wingfoot Air Express was conducting test flights over Chicago, flying between Chicago's Grant Park and White City. Described in the press as the first Army-style blimp to visit the city, the airship's third trip included a photographer from the Chicago Daily News named Milton Norton, who, by some accounts, asked the pilot, Jack Bettinger, to fly over the Chicago Loop so that he could take photographs. At 4:55 p.m., with thousands of Chicagoans watching, the gas bag caught fire for unknown reasons. The New York Times reported a spurt of flames was seen to shoot from the top of the gas bag near the center. The crowds gathered on the street to watch the flight saw the great mass quiver as it began to plunge. All 5 passengers bailed out using parachutes. Bettinger and Chief Mechanic Harry Wacker landed safely, but Mechanic Carl Weaver's parachute caught fire, and White City Amusement Park publicity agent Earl Davenport's parachute became entangled in the falling blimp. Both died. Norton broke both legs when landing, died from the injuries. But more terrifyingly, the burning airship plummeted 1,200 feet and fell through the skylight of the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank on the corner of LaSalle Street and Jackson Boulevard. The bank had closed, but some 150 employees, many of them young women tellers, were wrapping up their day. The New York Times reported, it seemed, according to the survivors, that the entire bank was instantly on fire. Breaking through the iron supports holding the glass overhead, the fuselage of the balloon, with 2 heavy engines and several gasoline tanks, smashed to the floor. The tanks exploded, scattering a wave of flaming gasoline over the workers within a radius of 50 feet. The accident, the Chattanooga, Tennessee News reported, is the first of its kind that has ever occurred over a great city. 10 bank employees, many of them young women, and one a 10-year-old bank runner, were killed in the resulting fire, and dozens more were injured. As a response, the city made rules about air travel over the city, closing Grant Park Airstrip and creating instead an air park southwest of the city that is now Midway International Airport. Goodyear continued to make balloons and blimps for the military, but in 1925 again produced their own design. The 105.5-foot-long Pilgrim was the first commercially licensed blimp in the nation. Originally designed to use hydrogen as its lifting gas, it instead was filled with non-flammable helium. This was the first blimp to have the Goodyear name and Wingfoot logo on the side, the first true Goodyear blimp. The Pilgrim was also built using an internal catenary curtain and cable design, which Goodyear patented in 1929 and would be the basis of further airship designs. And while these new airships were much safer, even using non-flammable helium, they were still subject to accidents. For example, the 86,000 cubic foot blimp Vigilant was launched June 27, 1929. Vigilant was named after a racing yacht. Starting in 1928, Goodyear named its blimps after yachts that had won the America's Cup. Vigilant had won the competition in 1893. Naming the Goodyear blimps after yachts was the idea of P.W. Litchfield, CEO of Goodyear Rubber, who viewed airships as aerial yachts that could play the same role over land that yachts did over water. The smallest in the Goodyear fleet at the time, the Vigilant was sometimes referred to as a baby blimp. On November 23rd, Vigilant was on its way to Atlanta, Georgia, to pick up Mr. Litchfield, who had been attending meetings of the directors of the United States Chamber of Commerce, to return him to Akron. Caught in fog, the Vigilant crashed into Smoky Mountain, 10 miles from Piedmont, Alabama. Nobody was injured, but the $60,000 airship was wrecked. But the car and fins were recovered and used in the construction of a new airship, the Columbia. The yacht Columbia had been the first to win 2 America's Cup competitions. The Columbia was a larger 112,000 cubic foot Type TZ blimp, and if being made literally from parts of another crashed airship is not enough, 2 days before Columbia was to be launched in Akron, another Goodyear airship, the Mayflower, was destroyed in an accident in Kansas City. The Tampa Bay, Florida Times reported, breaking away from a ground crew during a wind and rainstorm late Sunday, the Goodyear blimp Mayflower crashed into high-tension wires at the edge of the Kansas City Municipal Airport and burned. R.H. Hobensack, the Mayflower's co-pilot, reported that the Mayflower, which carried no passengers at the time, apparently caught fire when the gasoline lines were broken and the fuel ignited as the blimp crashed into highly charged wires. The crew of 4 had at the time been trying to get the Mayflower airborne in hopes of riding out the sudden storm. 2 crew members jumped from the gondola and received minor injuries, but the pilot, Captain Charles E. Brannigan, was trapped in the cabin and seriously burned. Hobensack pulled his captain from the stricken airship, receiving burns himself. It was an inauspicious start for the new airship, as the Columbia, literally built including parts of another crashed airship, prepared to launch on July 14th, according to the Akron Journal, to the tunes of a 200-piece band and a 200-voice chorus. The captain of yet another crashed blimp was in the hospital. Captain Brannigan died on the 17th. And Columbia would quickly experience the same sort of challenges that brought down the Mayflower. On August 1st, less than 3 weeks after it was launched, the International News Service reported that the Columbia was the object of an intensive search in northern Ohio and Michigan, after officials from Detroit contacted the Toledo airport, asking about the blimp's whereabouts after the blimp was unsighted 2 hours after it was scheduled to land. After what the Akron Beacon Journal described as 4 hours of anxiety, the Columbia arrived back in Akron, its pilots having decided to turn back after running into strong lightning storms over Toledo. The following October, Columbia was in New York City, where the ship delivered copies of the newspaper The Brooklyn Eagle over Long Island. It was, according to the Eagle, the first delivery of a newspaper by a lighter-than-air airship to scattered points on Long Island. But at 8 o'clock that evening, the Eagle reported, Captain Frank Trotter, with A.V. Kelly co-pilot and 2 mechanics, took her up for a test flight. The wind, the Eagle writes, was already stiff then, increased in velocity as the night advanced. Captain Trotter feared that if he attempted to land the ship, it would get beyond control of the land crew and crash against the hangar. As she cruised back and forth over the airport, the paper writes, hundreds of motorists along the northern boulevard halted their cars to watch her. But the wind only increased. The New York Daily News reported that throughout the involuntary endurance flight, the Columbia was in some danger of being blown out to sea. Failure of her 2 125-horsepower Warner Scarab engines would have compelled the pilot to valve out the helium gas and attempt a landing as a free balloon. By summoning a larger ground crew, the news writes, the crew were able to hold the ship steady for a period of 2 or 3 minutes, and while they were still unable to land the ship, these brief moments allowed time to change crews and toss in enough 5-gallon cans of fuel to keep the ship under control. By the time the wind died down to 12 miles an hour, still enough, the news writes, to give the 25 men on the handling guys trouble in maneuvering crosswind into the hangar, the Columbia had broken a record. The news reports that the rubber pig was in the air 31 hours and 45 minutes. This was a new duration record for a blimp. The previous record had been 20 hours. You might get the feeling that Columbia was tempting fate. On February 12, 1932, Columbia conducted 3 uneventful flights carrying passengers over New York City. But company policy was to stop carrying passengers when the wind got too high. Pilot Preston Dixon and mechanic John Blair then tried to return to Holmes Airport in Queens. But as they arrived, the wind was still strong, and an attempt to land was foiled by a gust. Dixon noted that there were only 6 ground crew, didn't think that was enough to handle the blimp in the wind. The Akron Beacon-Journal wrote in 2017, Blair scribbled a note, wrapped it around a wrench, and dropped it to the ground. It was a request for more men. The Coshocton, Ohio Tribune writes, they took to the air again, only vaguely alarmed. The sort of thing had happened to them before. The thing to do was to seek altitude and ride out the high wind. Dixon and Blair circled for an hour, waiting for more men and for the wind to die down. Sensing the ship was in distress, thousands of New Yorkers stopped what they were doing to watch, the Beacon-Journal writes. Finally, low on fuel, Dixon and Blair attempted to take the Columbia down. By now a ground crew of 25 had been gathered. But as Dixon started to land the blimp, the Cincinnati Enquirer writes, the non-rigid aircraft was banged against the ground by a sudden downdraft. The propeller was bent, the motor put out of commission, and a hole ripped in one of the gas bags. The Beacon-Journal writes, as Dixon shut off the engines to avoid a fire, an unexpected updraft lifted the wrecked blimp and ripped it from the hands of the ground crew. As the high winds continued, Dixon, perhaps wary of another disaster like what had happened with the Wingfoot Express in Chicago, hoped to take the Columbia over water, where it would not endanger people on the ground. The Beacon-Journal writes, I thought that Flushing Bay was the best bet, and the wind was carrying us straight for it. He later told a reporter, we figured on coming down in the water and hopping out of the gondola, but the winds carried the blimp back over land in a populated part of the Queens neighborhood of Flushing. The Daily News reported the madcap course of the hapless dirigible arrested the attention of hundreds of motorists. Thousands of people of Flushing watched, awestruck as Blair and Dixon fought to regain control of the lumbering craft. Dixon decided the best chance was to bring the blimp down quickly. He ordered Blair to pull the ripcord. The Beacon-Journal writes, this opens up a 25-foot gash in the top of the bag, and in any ordinary circumstance, this would cause the ship to fold up and hit the ground. Dixon later explained, I saw him reach for it, but the wind was so strong that it held the bag in place, and the gas did not come out immediately. It's unclear exactly how or why, but Blair, pulling the cord, was thrown from the blimp, still 50 feet above the ground, to his death. The Enquirer writes that as it was blown along close to the ground, the blimp struck several garages and tool houses. As it brushed against a house, it knocked Edward Craig, 63, from a ladder on which he was standing. Craig was cut on the face. Then, the Daily News writes, its envelope torn to shreds, the gondola and 2 Warner Scarab engines ripped from their moorings. The blimp flattened on the paving plant of Halton Armacite Company at Myrtle Avenue and Downing Street. The Enquirer writes, Dixon crawled from the wreckage, unhurt. There was little left of the blimp. The gondola was smashed, and the gas bag torn to shreds. The news reckoned Blair a hero. The crash occurred shortly before 2 p.m., when hundreds of shoppers and workers were returning from New York were on the streets. Police believe a more serious loss of life was prevented solely by the heroic efforts of Blair. As the blimp whirled towards the busy streets of Flushing, Blair seized the ripcord, which releases the gas content of the craft, and leaped into space. The $65,000 blimp Columbia was destroyed in front of thousands of witnesses less than 7 months after it was launched. It was one disaster of many in the time of the great airships. The Hindenburg disaster would occur 5 years later. But the Goodyear company was undaunted. They speeded up the construction of their new blimp Resolute to replace the Columbia. Are you a fan of forgotten history? Well, if so, why don't you consider supporting us on our page on Patreon, patreon.com/thehistoryguy, where even a small monthly donation can go a long way towards helping us to continue to produce episodes about history that deserve to be remembered. Patrons on Patreon get early access to some episodes, some exclusive content, and even possibly a History Guy challenge coin. Join today. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.